It is great to be back out here in Asia. As she mentioned, I was a foreign correspondent out here for Newsweek magazine based in South Korea in the late 80s and the early part of the 90s. I was in China, frankly, right after Tiananmen Square, among other things. And in the ensuing decades, my wife is British and absolutely adores India. So myself and my family, my wife, we spent quite a bit of time actually traveling on long trips into India. So I've gotten to know quite a bit of the region of India as well. So it's great to be back out in this region of the world. Now, what I'm going to be doing is trying to pull up what you're working on. My understanding is your industry is, of course, going through big transformations. Dell itself is going through a big transformation. And I want to start to put the transformation that you're experiencing in a much broader context, actually, because, in fact, the world is going through an extraordinary transformation. Really, I think in terms of world history, we're going to be looking back on this period of time as just really one of the handful of times where the world really fundamentally reinvented itself and went through a fundamental transformation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that all makes sense. Now, the way to start about this, a lot of IT conferences, you spend a lot of time looking at, what's the latest thing, the next thing coming out, and we spent a lot of time in this tweet time. We even were talking about it earlier here. The daily cycle, occasionally you kind of get punching up a little bit. You get a weekly cycle about what's going on in the news or something. Businesses, you're looking at maybe 3 months for quarterly reports. What I'm going to start to try to bring it up, though, is election cycles, actually. In fact, I was just in my hotel room watching the ends of the American election, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. But I'm going to pull it back into national history, the wavelength of what happens in your history and American history, and even into world history. And I'm going to really try to take the perspective of what will people in 50, 100, 150, even 200 years' time think when they look back at this early part of the 21st century. And when you look at it that way, you get the real essence of what's really going on in our world today. And that, at its core, is really transformational. And we're going to talk about that. Now, what happens essentially in these moments of real fundamental transformation in the world are you get to see two major things happen that prompt essentially an explosive period of innovation or transformation. One is what happens is you get such deep structural changes into the fabric of how the economy works, the global economy works, or how people live. So you move from an agricultural economy to the industrial economy, or you move from rural living to urban living. And these kind of big structural changes are what force kind of massive system change. Because the old systems don't work, new systems have to be redevised. The other thing is the world comes up against unprecedented challenges. This happens periodically, and the old systems have no ways to deal with this. And so what's happened, I'm coming from America, we've watched this happen in our country about 4 times. This is Thomas Jefferson. Way back in 1800, you watched it with the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln around the Civil War, the turn of the 20th century when we just were industrializing as a country, and ultimately coming off the Great Depression, World War II. We've seen it in America where you've essentially gotten these structural changes to the economy, these fundamentally new challenges, and you've watched an explosion of innovation or reinvention, a transformation, the words you're using, that lasts about 10 or 20 years, and they set up systems that last for 50 or 75 years later. We're in one of those now. That's really what we're in. That's what our country's in America, but it also is going on globally. And that's the argument I'm going to make to you here. Now, what would be our big structural changes? Well, this digital transformation that all your companies are in and that Dell's all part of, this digital transformation, the computerization of everything and the interconnection of everything is world historical. It will be seen like literally a handful of other times in human history where we've gone through this fundamental structural kind of technological change. But it's not just that. It's for the first time in the history of the planet we're really organizing all these systems globally. The idea that I can jump on a plane in San Francisco, being here today, you're coming from India, we're all here in Macau, it's in a thing that looks like it's in Vegas. That's a crazy kind of new shift that we've only just are starting to wrap our heads around the last 10, 20 years. But also we're coming up against really big new challenges, not the least of which is climate change. But what's happening all around the world, it's happening in Europe now too, is all the systems of the 20th century that were devised around the technologies of the 20th century, the kind of norms of the 20th century, they're all breaking down. They're all the kind of educational systems, healthcare systems, retirement systems. In Europe, the Euro system's going down. I mean, all these systems, because they aren't adapting to this highly interconnected, highly digitized, highly globalized world. And so whether you like it Or no, so there's a bunch of the kind of examples of that. So whether you like it or not, we're living through one of these really rare moments of transformation. We're really going from a world that many of you were born into, I certainly was, when it was totally analog, to one that's going to be totally, everything will be digital. We're going from one where it really was organized around nation states or localities, increasingly going to be organized at global levels. And you're basically going from a world where, based on carbon energy, coal-based, oil-based energy, to increasingly this century, which is going to be the next 50 years, a shift to cleaner energies, ultimately going from a way of life of the 20th century that's really unsustainable, much of which that you're picking up in India as well, into one that has to be much more sustainable for a planet that's going to have probably 9 to 10 billion people up from the 7 we have now. So, in essence, we're going from the 20th century to the 21st, and that is essentially the beauty of living at this time. Now, what I'm going to do in the time I have here, the quick time here, is try to just touch on several of these sub-transformations and run through a bunch of things that will just tee up in your minds how extraordinary this era is. The first one I'm going to talk about is get into that all-digital thing and throw it up. You guys are all from the tech world, but it bears repeating some really interesting developments here, and particularly in the next 10 years, what we can expect. I'm going to talk a little bit about this fully global world we're moving into. Again, you feel it and you know some of it. I'll touch on some other things you might not think about, and also look at this sustainable one. But I'm also going to do a couple other things. I'm going to actually dive a little deeper into India. I'm no expert in India, but I can see major things happening in India that fit it into this larger perspective. And ultimately, I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics that just unfolded in the United States, because, frankly, there's some very big developments there that I think are going to have profound implications long-term in the rest of the world. And ultimately, I'm going to end up with a little bit quick on this transformation idea. A lot of stuff to cover. Don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to move fast here and do it as best I can with in front of you here. Again, digital revolution, you all get it. You've all heard of, the Moore's Law kind of juggernaut of the doubling of computing power every 18 months to 2 years. But it's a really extraordinary thing, to the point where you can take one of the first PCs here, back in the 1980 rough time, and here's a Dell computer from 30 years later. And if you just get it down to the megahertz per megahertz, you do the math on what 1 megahertz cost back then and what 2 gigahertz or 2,000 megahertz cost. I mean, computers really have gone from 10,000 times more powerful, or 10,000 times cheaper. I mean, that is an extraordinary dynamic for any industry. And of course, it's one of the extraordinary things. And we have at least 10 years now to continue on this juggernaut. In fact, there's some developments thinking we're going to actually get it even another 10 years. So at least 10 and probably 20 years more of what we can squeeze out of this extraordinary development. Now, what that's done is we've taken what used to be supercomputers in the late 70s, the same time as that first computer, that first PC, the megaflops, if you just measure it by megaflops, speed essentially, clock speed, that clock speed is essentially in an iPad 2 now. And you've gone from a $31 million computer to a $200 computer. And again, this is going to extend out for another 10 or 20 years. Extraordinary power. In fact, that same chip flipped into the iPhone 4S. Again, just watching in actuality, we know this, but it's actually astounding to look at those numbers. Now, what's happened since that point now, we've actually moved from these iPhones into the iPads, and I know now Dell and with the Surface coming out with from Microsoft and another development. Again, I'm using different images here. Some might be Apple, some might be Dell, some might be whatever. But in general, the whole industry is moving down this path of solving this last piece, was how do you get the last piece of digital information, which is long-form, magazine-like, and video, onto these pads. And of course, that's been cracked among the many ones going. But here's what's interesting. Looking ahead, what people are underestimating is how all these are now embedded with video cameras. Again, the Surface and others right in there too. Why is this important? This is a really big development. Because in fact, we spent 1 million years figuring out how to communicate with the power of our faces. See, really smiling, my fake smiling, kind of smiling. And we've spent only about 10 years doing it with our thumbs, and even a little bit longer, but 30 years maybe by our fingers. The amount of information you can move through video is extraordinarily more. And that's what we're heading into in the next 10 years here. Now, let me just talk a little bit quickly about the video shift that I think is underestimated even in quite sophisticated computer circles like yourselves. Now, if you look at the two booms of the internet, this is essentially the migration of all digital media onto the internet. If you start in 1980 or 1990, this is when I was at Wired Magazine, and we were talking about the digital revolution and how this was going to suck in all media over the internet, and people thought we were crazy. Well, you did have a low bandwidth internet boom, that all text essentially in the 90s there that did it, but it took the bigger pipes, bigger bandwidth to get the later kind of bigger files in succession, audio files, then video files, and ultimately now we're seeing the film industry getting upset. So you got now basically 20 years of this getting sucked in. That same 20 years, if you look at traffic on the backbone of the internet, in the early days, the web didn't exist, right? So the percentage of web traffic was nothing. By 2000, they had the 90s boom, half of all internet traffic was on the web. But what's happened here? 2005, that's YouTube. Look what's happened with the backbone. By 2010, already 50% of all traffic on the backbone of the internet was video. Now, if you extend that out to 2015, Cisco, which makes all the routers, is anticipating it's going to be over 90% of all traffic on the internet will be video. 90%. Now, that doesn't mean everything goes away because the bandwidth is getting bigger. But even so, an extraordinary shift to this visual medium of communicating. And we've seen it very quickly happen with the rise of YouTube. YouTube did not exist in 2005. By this year, 2012, it is essentially sending off 4 billion videos a day. 4 billion a day. This is just one. Granted, it's the biggest site. That's an extraordinary. There's only 7 billion people on the planet, right? Extraordinary numbers. The uploads as well. That same time, every minute we got 48 hours of video going up onto YouTube. The equivalent way to think about that is it took, in 30 days, you put more video onto YouTube than 60 years of all television stations in all the world combined. An insane amount of video. The speed of this is extraordinary. What's interesting, though, is you're watching the two-way video now is starting to open up. By 2010, you already had 500 million people on Skype. And this will only continue to chart up. And the latest development, which is a very, very big deal, is how all the biggies, and Skype being bought by Microsoft last year for $8 billion. Also, Google now has these Google Hangouts. It's group video. How do we get more than one person one-on-one? And now it's consistently getting up to 10 people. Again, Skype is up to 10. Hangouts are up to 10. Apple gets it up to about 4. The point is, all the biggies are investing big in this big investment in group video. My own new company, as she mentioned, called Reinventors, we're using this as a new medium, considering it, and watching the power of what you can do, getting many people in virtual roundtables, essentially. Anyhow, an extraordinary development that's happening in video. Now, flip it around then to this social media. We're going to be talking a lot about social things with the other speakers. I just want to take one piece of that into the work world, which is we're finally getting to the point. The holy grail when I was at the early Wired magazine was how do you eventually take a physical meeting, everything you can do here, and do it virtually over the web. And 20 years ago, that was a real stretch, and people said, it'll never happen. Well, so what we started figuring out is, well, you can get on the phone and you can use email, and we took these one-off tools to supplement, let's say, what you could do over the phone, and that kind of made sense. What happened in the last 10 years was all the biggies, including Microsoft, came up with their own versions of an integrated package of how to get that collaboration working in a more unified, interconnected way, and there was a lot of good attempts, including some crash and burns like Google Wave, of which I was involved with, and then they pulled the plug on that. But ultimately, you've seen some startups in this space. Again, Yammer was just bought by Microsoft as a solution that's trying to use. Anyhow, ultimately, we're watching this as it gets more and more integrated to essentially this virtual meeting. And this is really a big deal because this starts to do where you can do really serious work. I would say, again, Google is an interesting their version of Google+, which takes the capability of social networking of Facebook, but basically brings that virtual hangout of up to 10 people visually and ultimately has all these Google Docs. It's an interesting way of essentially more effective collaboration because there's not that much difference now between what you can do. This is President Obama and his cabinet. 10 people around the room, working on a common document, reading the eyes, really understanding the kind of subtleties of communication. That's now possible and will increasingly be so in this next 5 to 10 years. Big shift. I just want to say one thing here, give one example of what happens when you start to connect up this video channels. And here's a guy who essentially composed a chorus, recruited through YouTube, got all these young people to sing, audition, and he's put them all together in a beautiful piece here. I just want to give you a little sense of what you can actually do when you start to collaborate visually online. An interesting thing about that is everybody in there was under age 30. You can see it's a total generational shift, but the ability to work with these video cameras and think as though you're there, it's in the lifeblood of how these young people work. Very interesting thing. Now, I'm going to shift quickly. Again, we spent a little more time on tech there than we will on some of these other things. But I want to also tee up how tech is driving this globalization of everything, and it's only going to get incredibly more in the future here. So this is if you take 2000, turn of the century. This is essentially the percentages of people online by region in the world. And even in the United States, which had kind of gotten on this earlier, it was only about 30% of the populations were online in North America there. And even in Asia, and you can see the levels relatively low when you think about it. It's only 12 years ago. This is currently in 2010, this is what happened. And you can see the different regions pulling up fast behind, including the Middle East, which basically didn't have anything in 2000, and of course now is wired up to the extent where you're watching incredible movement, social movement happening there. But anyhow, you can see this is on track. The whole world is actually tracking up in this way. Now, if you take it out 10 years, or actually let's just take our snapshot right now in the whole world. Right now we roughly have about a third of the planet online. About 2 billion people, a little over 2 billion people online. What we've also got is about 75% of the planet has cell phones. Not necessarily smartphones, but cell phones. And so you can easily see by the end of this decade, the entire world is going to get filled out. There'll be few pockets that won't have it. But on the backs of that voice phone will come the internet. And on the back of that basic internet connection will get 4G and higher. And so you can totally count on, by the end of this decade, the entire world being all connected up in high bandwidth, kind of with holding on to these smartphones, which are now, like you say, $31 million supercomputers. Now, again, you're living this, you're seeing this, but when you start to plan like this, you go, it's quite extraordinary how fast that has actually worked in historical terms. Now, what I want to shift again is the technology shift is not just the gadgets. Technology has driven fundamental economic change and growth for a long time. There's two major things that drive economic growth. New technologies that you can do totally new things economically, and tighter integration into markets, and more fluid and easier ways to connect and trade and actually make things happen. And the last time we saw this was World War II, the classic boom that came off of the West in World War II. And that's what happened. After World War II, you had all these new technologies developed in the war, mainframe computers, new atomic energy, plastics, moved into the private sector. And then you have half the world, the United States and kind of the West, Japan, integrate into essentially one integrated market. And essentially what happened then in the 50s, the great boom in the United States, was because the United States took advantage of both those early. By the 60s, though, the entire West was on fire in terms of its growth. And ultimately, it was only in the 70s when you had oil, the lifeblood of that industrial economy, quadruple in price twice. It stopped about a 30-year run of growth. Well, now you folks have been part of this exact same thing, which has happened after the Cold War. Because after the Cold War, two things happened. The same two things. All this technology developed in the Cold War, computer chips were for guided missiles. They were for cruise missiles. Basically, that's the first application of them. The internet was for communicating in nuclear war, decentralized means. All these satellite images we're getting of Google Maps and things like that, all developed to spy on the Russians and all that stuff. It all moves into the private sector, one. Two, the entire world. India comes off socialism, quasi-socialism. China comes off communism. We get the entire world on the same global economy. And what happened? The 90s was the U.S. took advantage of it quick. We take to technology quick. We're the most open economy usually, relatively open. We were booming, right? But the last decade, you've been booming. Just like Japan and the West was booming in that first boom. The entire thing just kept going globally. It's on fire. And it was only this decade, with the financial craziness, the lifeblood of this system is finance, and with the craziness of what happened in the crash, we screwed it up. But we had an incredible run, a 30 years run. And this is, again, what we're about to reinvent and go into the next phase here. Now, here's if you look out to what's going on in terms of to the future, to 2050. This is GDP of the United States. We're going to be a player for a while here. But here's China coming up here. The debate is actually, it's probably going to be faster overtaking the United States, but still you're watching that happen. But here's your India. India is right there, fast following. By basically 2050, you'll be in the game with essentially in the same level as basically the United States and just shy of China. Ultimately, that's those two down there you can barely see. That's Germany and Japan. So just to take a snapshot in 2050, that's the global economy. And the 20th century powers, Germany and Japan, are basically irrelevant. It's going to be the big three. That's who we're talking to right now. We're in China, we're talking to India, and I'm from America. This is really what's going to drive the global economy. Now, I hear a clap there. Okay, there we go. Now, China, there's a lot to be said about China. We don't have time to go too much in it. I do want to say two things. China has some huge difficulties here, and you guys have your challenges too. But the challenge here, what's extraordinary about China is how they have gone from when they opened up to market economies, 1980, they had 80% of their population was living on the UN standard of $1.25 a day. They've now got that down to 18%. But that's still an extraordinarily big chunk of people, peasants that are really struggling out there. That's the size of Indonesia, basically. They still have to move into, essentially, one of their challenges. They've also got these severe environmental problems. Again, things that you can relate to. But these are getting to be really problematic, and we're watching a lot of public protests on this now. You're watching a lot of backlashes happening here. And ultimately, the big one that they have, and here I am sitting in China, I got to watch it maybe a little bit, but I will say, this is an extraordinary difficult transition to make. There is no example in the history of the world of an empowered and prosperous middle class not demanding and eventually getting full access to democracy. India has made an extraordinary leg up on that. You've done it. You're there. You've got long practice in it. This is a huge strategic advantage, and this is a very, very difficult thing that they're heading into. And we're in the middle of a transition right now, a leadership transition, that they're really struggling with this right now. So, just to stop on that, I'm going to get back to India in a minute here. But I want to tee up the third thing that everyone really has to tune into, particularly every business. And that's essentially this idea of this shift, wrapping our heads around climate change and understanding that how we have to get much more sustainable in all of what we do. This is not just some buzzword. This is fundamental science that's happening out here. This is basically CO2 emissions on the planet for 1,000 years, and it was flat until the Industrial Revolution, and this is the 20th century. We are sending way, way, way more CO2, which traps the heat in the atmosphere, than ever before. It's undeniable this is happening. It's also undeniable by the facts we are warming the planet in very severe ways. This is the last 25 years of the 20th century. It's just the vast consensus is that this is happening, and we're watching it. And we're watching essentially here. I just came back from New York. New York was just devastated by a thing that never had happened before. This is the norm. This is what's happening. You're guys going to have your own versions of it, including, in fact, the monsoons. My understanding is the monsoons coming off the Himalayas will start dropping their water further out to sea, and you're going to have some very serious water problems if a lot of the modeling actually works out here. These are very serious concerns. Everybody has to really tune into this stuff. And so what I want to just point out in this quick little thing here is to say, this is essentially how much energy the world is using right now. 18 terawatts. You're pulling your side, we're pulling our side. And this is where it's coming from. Coal, big chunk, oil, plants, including in the developing world and including, I think, in India, quite a bit of plants are still being built. Anyhow, this is the basic. This is nuclear, and this is renewables. Those little slivers. This is essentially how we're using energy, big chunks. It's not just cars. This is cars, and this is electricity. That's what people think about energy. But huge other things, heating and, industrial manufacturing. Huge chunks of what's happening. This is the growth of energy use from the 1970 to now. Every country in the world, the entire world is going up. We aren't going down. This is the U.S. in the base, which is relatively flat. You guys are orange, and that's China is red. We're all going up, and you guys are taking bigger slices of the pie. But one thing is undeniable. We're using more energy, no question. Somehow, we have to, by mid-century, before we get a 2% rise in the planet's atmosphere, which we're up against soon now, we got about 25 years to stop this 2% rise. And to do that is going to require a shift to cleaner energies dramatically. Now, they can be cleaner than coal and get to still carbon, which is natural gas, but whatever it is, we got to move fast. And so people are trying to wrap their heads around how do we get much bigger sense of nuclear, much more sense of geothermal, solar, wind. You get the point. Great industries of the future, great growth potential of the future, but also it's going to be very pressing coming up here. Now, we got those three big pieces, right? The world's going digital, the world's going global, the world's going sustainable. I just wanted to tee up India, and again, this is just the beginning of this conversation. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to give you a little quick hit here. But I would say what's interesting is you are well positioned in all three of these, or two of the three, I'd say. You're quite well positioned. The all-digital industry, you're here. You're from the IT industry. You've really got a fantastically globally competitive group there. You've got the whole outsourcing phenomena, totally great. You're starting to actually, in your population, apparently you got about 75% of all Indians on a phone, more than people have electricity and more than have television by far. So you've got an interesting base to start with in a way that other parts of the world do not have, for sure. What's interesting, though, for you guys, if I had to give advice, is this is the smartphone penetration globally. And you can see places like Japan and South Korea are very high, their penetration, and the U.S., in fact. China and India quite low yet. But this is the supercharged one. When you connect everybody up with these phones, which you currently have done, building that bandwidth out and getting the smartphones in people's hands makes incredible power, what they could do very quickly. Within 10 years, you could have everybody with a really powerful smartphone connected by high bandwidth. That, to me, would be a huge boost to national strategy. Anyhow, I'm going to shift quickly to the global piece. You guys, again, are extremely well positioned on certain things. Particularly in higher education, this is interesting. You guys have more institutions of higher education than any country, including China. You're going to have 12% of the world total of graduates by the end of this decade, and ultimately you're punching out about 500,000 engineering grads a year. Now, that's extraordinary on the numbers. Now, my understanding is the quality isn't up to necessarily always global or international standards, and in fact, how good that is another thing. But there's the challenges there, too. But you actually got well positioned. But this is your ace in the hole. India really is extraordinary in that you've got this English language thing. I mean, it is clear the operating language of business, of everything now, is migrating very rapidly to English, right? And you've got 125, by these numbers, I don't know, you might have better numbers than me, but you compare to the really good English speakers compared to English, China, Brazil, and Russia, extraordinary advantage there. If you look at the percentages of your population, again, about 12% of your population compared to literally 1% down there in China. Huge strategic advantage about integrating into this global economy. Now, the third thing I'll bring up in this sustainable thing, though, is a difficult one. And again, I think you're the leaders of your community, you're the leaders of your country, you are the most powerful and vigorous industry. You've got to start coming to terms with this sense of basic infrastructure and going beyond the enclaves of a lot of these tech cities. Bangalore, a place that it's interesting, the New York Times just ran a front page story in the New York Times actually about this, and you might know this a lot better than me, but it's quite extraordinary that the breakdown in basic refuse, garbage disposal and things, is quite an actually interesting story to me. But it is get this point where it's now shifted to where you have to get the governance, the infrastructure, and the broader thing for your whole economy going. And it is really the critical piece, I think, is now moving into the innovation and governance for India, as it is in other parts of the world, too. And so I'll leave you right there with that. but I'll leave it with this last thing here, is in that case, the big sustainability challenge for you, this is going out to 2050, this is looking like, this is the rural to urban split in India up until current and what's projected. Somehow you have got to shift a lot more of your population into cities for basic sustainability reasons. And so that infrastructure that's not working now has got to be rebuilt in a way to really work in the 21st century. And so I think there's huge opportunities for business, huge opportunities for IT in that too. But anyhow, you've got your challenges, but you're totally up to the task. Now I'm going to just wind up here with my time allotted with a few reflections on what happened just in the United States. And for those of you who might have watched this, it literally just happened. Obama took a much more significant victory than anyone had been predicting, although I had been predicting it. He just won a very good margin of the Electoral College, and he's got a mandate now with the Senate in his party's hands continuing to do that. But I want to explain to you what's happening. There is essentially a shift that's happening in American politics that's like a once a 30-year shift, and Obama just pulled it off. And so what I would basically say is there's two sides of American politics, there's some version of this works in India. But there's essentially a pull that's what we call a progressive push and a conservative push in American politics. And one is progress, it's in the word, going forward. Conserve is like hang on to the past, it's in the word. It's moving future-oriented, past-oriented. It's essentially using active government or not active government in the conservative side. And ultimately, it's about reinvention, trying new things, innovation, or reaction. Let's stick with what we got. This is the debate, essentially, that's happened in all those junctures in American history. Both parties have, at one time, led it, the progressive side, and also both sides have been against it. And this is essentially what had happened in this election, was it was made very clear to the American public this was the choice. And after Ronald Reagan had started this conservative thing 30 years ago, Mitt Romney was the last to push it, and we have now watched 2 cycles of Obama moving everybody forward. The new politics is going to move in this direction. It's going to be more active government. It's going to be more globally interconnected. More of this, of where you see Obama going, is where the country's going. And for 2 quick reasons. The demographics of the country are such that this is the aging baby boomers. This is an age demographic. But this is the young people. The biggest generation in American history is the millennial generation, the kids of the boomers. They are now of voting age. They are voting overwhelmingly for Obama and the Democrats. They have huge advantages now for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And the other thing is, the Republicans have essentially been the party of white people now in this last election. This is the America, percentages of whites coming down and percentage of other races coming up in our country since the 60s. That's what elected Obama the first time. This is where the country is going, actually. Boom, to there. By 2050, it's going to be a minority white and a majority other races. And this is, again, the coalition that is overwhelmingly now gone for Obama and the Democrats. So what I'm just trying to tell you that is this is not a fluke. This isn't a fluke, the second thing. There is a shift going on in American politics. Follow where that's going. It's going to have a lot of implications globally. It's going to have a lot of implications foreign policy, but also economics. Now, the wind up here, I just want to say, we're in another one of these transformative moments, whether it's in America reinventing itself, whether it's India reinventing itself, whether it's Europe coming out of the Eurozone, figuring it out. China's in a big struggle now. Everybody's got to figure this next phase out. And so if you look at the last time the world, not just America, but the world went through this, was at coming off the Great Depression of World War II. Very comparable level of we had to start over. They had their same challenges. Their climate change was nuclear war. They didn't know what to do about it. They had their own kind of versions of the economic troubles that we're seeing, in fact, in some ways worse. And so all they could do, which is all you can ever do, is you take the technologies you have at hand, you take the human resources you have at hand. These are some of his advisors, FDR's advisors, and they're kind of figuring it out. And then you take the tools you had at hand. They had typewriters, for God's sake, right? The women would type out the orders and get down. This is the level of computational power they had basically back then. But ultimately, from the point of view of, again, a more of an American perspective, but basically the world economy did get pulled out with a new kind of environment called Keynesian economics. We did watch essentially communism contained and the fascism defeated and nuclear balance. There's never been a nuclear bomb that's gone off since that period after the way they figured that out. They created the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank. All that was happened in about the space of 3 3 years. Again, institutions that have a lot of implications for you folks as well. And essentially, there's a ton of domestic programs that make sense domestically in the United States that grew the middle class. This all happened in 15 years. They didn't know what they were doing. 15 years later, they did it. And of course, we look back 50, 100, 200 years later, we'll be looking back at an extraordinary period of world history. It set up Nehru, Gandhi, your entire country came out of there, a completely transformed world, right? That's the level of change we're heading into. That's the level of transformation. Now, so what I'm saying is we're back to our period here. There's one way to look at it is an Obama second term. The other way to look at it is an Indian next 10 years. And again, the world in the next 10 years. And here's what I would say about this. If you go back, take our human resources. And this is just taking the United States as an example. We could do it in India, an Indian version of this. But if you go back to World War II, this is a chart of less than 5% of all people in the United States had college-educated degrees at the time of World War II. Today, it's about 30%. By the way, in India, I think your latest generation is about at 16%, and you're pushing it, trying to get it up to 30%. But anyhow, this is a kind of a comparable situation in some respects. But anyhow, college-educated people, not the only people that count in this, but are not a bad group to draw off of in a transformation. So in other words, in the United States, we have about 15 times as many people with degrees. But the key thing, so there's human resources there that they didn't have anything close to. But the key thing is, if you would have talked to like FDR or Nehru or whoever at that time and said, look I've got this thing where you can ask any question in the world and get all the world's information back in a second, prioritized. I mean, they would have thought you were crazy, right? I mean, that would have just been ludicrous. It was magic. It was impossible. And today it's obvious. Every one of your kids knows how to do it, using Bing or Google or whatever you're going to use, right? It's an extraordinarily powerful tool and only going to get better, as I mentioned. So we have everything we need at this incredible juncture in world history. Everything. When I say we, it's America, India, the world. We have everything we need to make this transition to this all-digital society, which is going to be very, very different than the society we've been used to. We're going to make this very difficult, but doable transition to a much more globally integrated society, increasingly integrated. And we're going to be able to make this transition, which is even more difficult, into this much more sustainable society. We're using these new clean energies and working on a kind of much more sustainable, all products in a much more sustainable lifestyle. But ultimately, it's going to be the part where people will look back in 50 or 100 years' time, 200 years' time, and they'll say, the early 21st century, that was the time where the world went digital. That was the time when the world went global. That was the time when the world went sustainable. That's the time when America reinvented itself one more time, India reinvented itself one more time, China, other regions of the world. That's essentially when the world went through this last big transformation, set up the world for the 21st century, and really did pull off what was seen at the time as an incredibly daunting task. And so with that, I would say thank you very much. You've been a great audience. You've got a great few days ahead of you, and I'm really looking forward to actually spending some time with you tonight. And tomorrow, too, I'll be around. And if you want to get a hold of me, this is my new company. You can follow me on Twitter, and love to keep the conversation going. Thank you very much.